Hello everyone, Kevin Remdy here, IT Pro Evangelist with Microsoft, and today I'm going to be talking about part 2 of my series on how I built my private cloud. Now what I want to do here is talk about the infrastructure, really the pieces, the components that made up my private cloud. As you may recall in part 1, which was actually part 10 of our cloud series, and that was actually on my blog here, part 10 of our series, Cloud on Your Terms, I discussed my mad house of cloud, and I use this as my kind of part 1 introduction of the goals and really what I wanted to accomplish by building this test environment, using minimal hardware, evaluation software, and so on. And you see in this diagram here the hardware that's involved. Now the machine that we're on right now is this Lenovo W510. That's my management server, that's my storage server, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also where I'm doing the recordings for this screencast. I drive all of my management from here, so I've got the consoles for, in this case, Virtual Machine Manager, and the iSCSI Software Target, and the Failover Cluster Manager. These are all installed on this box to manage the different components of my test environment. You see also that they're connected over a test network, just a 1 gigabit network. That's actually just my home network. It's my family's network. My wife connects to this wirelessly from her laptop upstairs. My kids connect to this. My boys play Xbox Live across it. So it's basically just a real simple home network configuration. And then I have 2 Lenovo T61Ps connected as the cluster nodes. Now these are old laptops. These are 4 years old. These are machines that I've taken with me on the road for a number of years doing TechNet events. And I've put them into semi-retirement now. So now they're sitting next to me on a table here as my cluster nodes. So that's the hardware configuration. 3 laptops, gigabyte network, and an external disk. And I'll talk about the disk when I talk about storage in just a minute here. Now what am I doing for the software? Well, the software, I'm just using Windows Server 2008 R2 with SP1. And you may be wondering, well, hey, where do I get this software? If I want to install all these machines, I don't have to buy 3 copies of Windows Server. Good news, go to aka.ms/evals. In fact, I'll go ahead and do that right now. And what that does is a link to my blog and the post of where I put the links to find those evaluation software downloads. So for example, if I want to install Windows Server as a platform like I've done here on these 3 boxes, I can click on this link and download Windows Server 2008 R2 with SP1. If I want to go another route and install on my cluster nodes, for example, the Hyper-V server, the free download of the hypervisor, I can actually do that from here also. If I want to download some of the management tools that are available currently in the current releases of tools such as System Center Virtual Machine Manager or Operations Manager or Configuration Manager, I can get those here. Or if I decide to go with the System Center 2012 pre-release products, the release candidates and the betas, I think most of these tools are available in release candidate form now, but I can actually click on that. That'll open up a page where I can then do the downloads, either download them all at once or select the individual pieces of the System Center suite and download those individually. And it's also a good resource too to see what's available. If I scroll down here, I can actually see the different tools and which ones are in release candidate form, which ones are currently still in beta, and so on. And learn more about the system requirements as well. The next piece of it was the network, and I mentioned that I'm using just my home gigabit Ethernet connection. And just to show you a little bit more of that, I'll go ahead and open up the Network and Sharing Center on my server here and look at some of the adapters. And some of these are configured because I've configured these as network switches, as virtual switches in Hyper-V. In fact, I can open up the Hyper-V Manager and look at the Virtual Network Manager. And again, I'm just really showing what I've got configured here. I'm going to be walking through the actual configuration in a later screencast. But notice I'm using a loopback adapter that I installed, physical piece, physical in terms of this virtualization, so that I could use an external network connected to that. And I can actually associate multiple machines to, for example, a test network called Contoso.com. I'm not actually using that currently, but I could at some later point. Or an internal network, named internal, and we can see that those names represented when I look back at the network adapters and see here's the loopback adapter, that's the physical connection, and there's the virtual one. And I named these Contoso Physical. I actually did that right here in order to make them more readable. There's the virtual switch, and the important one here is this external one. So I've named this external. It's associated with the actual physical NIC on this laptop, and that shows up here. And what you'll also see in Hyper-V is when I look at the properties of that NIC, that it's only associated with this virtual network switch protocol. I'm not doing any addressing here, any other protocols other than that one. So I'll leave that one alone because where the configuration really happens is here. And again, I'm going to go into more details on how this is all configured in a later screencast, but just to look at the properties here quickly, I can see that I'm using static addressing for my machines that are part of this little network here. I did static addressing also for the cluster, the actual cluster name itself, as well as my file server that I'm running in the cluster. So you'll see all of that in a later screencast. So networking is fairly straightforward, fairly simple, and I'm using just the same home network addressing that's coming from my home router. So very simple. And again, that's the idea with this, building this, is make it really easy to build and bring up a test network. Get to that in a second. On the storage side, I'm using an external drive. I have a USB 3 connected 2 terabyte drive, 7200 RPM, so it's a good fast performing drive, and I'm using USB 3, so again it's also fast. And let's take a look at that actually. I'm going to open up the Windows Explorer here and look at my drives, and there's that 2 terabyte drive that I have. Still have a bit of space available to it. I'm using it for a number of things, storing a lot of things on that drive because it is a very big drive. But the important pieces for my cluster are right here. I have a number of VHD files. Now those VHD files were created when I used the iSCSI target, and I'm making this the storage server. This is my storage location. These disks are being used for shared storage in my cluster. In fact, this one, TB disk, is actually a 1 terabyte disk. I can see that when I mouse over the size of that disk. That is actually being used as my cluster shared volume storage for the sake of my virtual machines. And I can actually see the result of that if I look at either one of these nodes in my cluster. I actually have remote desktop connected to these machines so that I can access them and work with them. Here is the C drive on one of the nodes in my cluster, and there is a mount point called cluster storage. And again, when we configure our failover cluster and I enable cluster shared volumes, this will create this cluster storage, and it will point to certain storage to use for that. And that mount point is just connecting across the network to a location that has a 1 terabyte size disk holding these contents. So each of my cluster nodes can see these virtual machine files, and then in turn are able to use Hyper-V and failover clustering. So more detail on that in a later screencast. But that's really the basics. Now, I want to give you some additional resources here. Again, if you want to download the software, go to aka.ms/evals. If you want to see the list of blog posts in our cloud series, you can go to aka.ms/cloud series. And of course, a link to my blog directly, aka.ms/fullofit. Well, thank you again very much for watching this screencast. I hope you found it useful, and we'll see you on the next one.